I've done a lot of Cosmere videos, but one of the characters that I feel like I've been building up to is Hoid. And if you really want to dig into what Hoid's deal is in all of his appearances across the Cosmere, this video is the one for you. This video is going to be divided up into 4 parts. One is I'm going to break down who Hoid is, along with all of his appearances across the Cosmere books. Second is 5 things that we know for certain about him, which, spoiler alert, doesn't really add up to that much. Third is 3 kind of major frameworks for understanding Hoid's motivations, which I term as one, like this more altruistic cosmic caretaker, something that's a little bit more selfish, like a selfish seeker, and then something that's a little bit more aimless, like an aimless wanderer. And then 4 is my take on how his goals have evolved over the 10,000 years that he's been wandering the universe. So with that, let's get into it. There will be spoilers for all of the Cosmere books. Honestly, the Stormlight Archive up through the end of Wind and Truth, Mistborn Eras 1 and 2, Warbreaker, references to all of the secret projects, including Trust of the Emerald Sea, Isles of the Emberdark, The Sunlit Man, and Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, and Elantris as well. So up front, who is Hoid and where have we seen him? And in general, as kind of a broad rule of thumb, if you see somebody that's like a storyteller or a beggar or somebody with angular features and either jet black hair or jet white hair, that's usually a reference to Hoid, even if he is not explicitly named as such. Here's where we see him. In the Stormlight Archive, that's probably where we see him the most on screen or on book. And in that, he takes on the role of wit, i.e. the court jester in the Alethi court. This position is kind of like an established position where somebody just takes on the role of making fun of all of the various Alethi light eyes. And Hoid sort of like installs himself as the new wit, kind of early on in the story. And we see him through the course of those 5 books nudge various characters along in their journeys. And he seems to take a particular liking to Dalinar, Shallan, Kaladin, and then eventually forms a romantic relationship with Jasnah as well. Early on, he's pretty distant, but in Words of the Radiance, he gives Dalinar what I think is the most revealing glimpse into his motivations. And he says, "While I am your friend, please understand that our goals do not completely align. If I have to watch this world crumble and burn to get what I want, I will do so." But despite this, over time he becomes increasingly involved in Roshar, the planet's fate. He takes real risks in opposing Odium and helping Dalinar, and he bonds a cryptic and becomes a Lightwaver, so becomes Radiant himself. We also learn in the Stormlight Archive that he holds a Dawn Shard, which is one of the most mysterious and powerful artifacts in the Cosmere. I'll get to it in a moment, but he holds a Dawn Shard that he eventually turns over at the end of Wind and Truth. All right, moving on to Hoid's appearance in Mistborn, where his role is much smaller. In Era 1, he has kind of brief appearances as a storyteller or a beggar, but he generally isn't really named, and he observes rather than intervenes. In Era 2, he's a little bit more upfront. He takes on the role of the coachman for Wax, so the main character, and we see him helping those 2 main characters along in their fight against the god that is attacking the planet, who's known as Autonomy. In Warbreaker, Hoid appears again as a storyteller. He appears in the court of the gods, and he explains some of the backstory of the planet to the princess, that's Princess Ciri. And that's very classic Hoid, using stories to convey truths indirectly. In Elantris, he makes a super brief cameo. We see him as a beggar, try and fail to become Melantrian, so take on the powers. Outside of that, he's basically non-existent. And he makes appearances in 4 of Brandon Sanderson's secret projects, which are set relatively far into the future of the Cosmere. And his appearances in these secret projects are particularly interesting because he's involved, but he's usually off screen. So he's operating through mentees or proxies in effect. In Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, he's the narrator, but he spends most of the time in the book kind of like frozen as a coat rack. So most of the engagement that he does during that book is actually by his cryptic design. Trust of the Emerald Sea is also narrated by Hoid, but similarly, he is rendered basically insensate because of a curse. And the only major time that we see him engage in that book in a serious way is when he succeeds in becoming Elantrian. In Isles of the Emberdark, we learn that he's imprisoned in like some sort of a box, so he's not able to engage again. But his mentee is a dragon known as Starling, who often thinks about him and references him in making her own decisions on how to act, and we see him really briefly talking to her in the spiritual realm. And then in the Sunlit Man, again, he's off screen in some capacity, but we see him briefly talk to Nomad, the main character, again, to kind of give him a little bit of assurance and support as he navigates his own journey. And I have a separate video about what I think Hoid is secretly doing in The Sunlit Man, which I'll link to in the description. So all of this to say, as we head into the future, Hoid is basically in some capacity incapacitated and operating through his mentees or his proxies. So, moving on to part 2. With all of these observations and appearances across the Cosmere, what do we actually know about Hoid? And for all of his appearances, hard facts are pretty scarce. So I've broken it out into 5 major points about Hoid. All right, number 1 is that he is old, like 10,000 years old. So he is one of the oldest characters that we see in the Cosmere. He originates from a planet known as Yolen, which is kind of this mysterious planet populated by humans and dragons and maybe one other species, but that we know very little of. And in The Sunlit Man, he talks about being a boy on Yolen, looking out to the stars, wanting to explore the Cosmere. And in the 10,000 years since his boyhood, he really has spent that time, those millennia, exploring the Cosmere. Number 2 is that during his youth on Yolen, he helped kill Adonalsium, who is basically the closest to a one god that the Cosmere has had. Hoid was part of a group of roughly 18 people that shattered Adonalsium into 16 pieces, or 16 shards, and those shards are the ones that have essentially become gods across the Cosmere. His motivations within this group of people for killing Adonalsium remain unclear, and I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. But we do see hints of regret in his decision. And he achieved this goal of shattering Adonalsium with the others by using the Dawn Shards, which are these artifacts or weapons that have this immense power because they were able to shatter the one god. Number 3 is that he refused to take up a shard after the shattering of Adonalsium. So of the 18 people that were involved in the shattering of Adonalsium, 16 of them took up a shard. Hoid was not one of them. He refused a piece of that kind of like deific power. And like his reason for participating in the shattering of Adonalsium, his reason for refusing to take up a shard is also unclear. It kind of fits his like avoid responsibility persona that he adopts, but the actual reason kind of is unclear. But what it means is that he interacts with the shards of the gods in the Cosmere kind of as peers, because they are his peers. Number 4 is that even as he refused a shard, he has spent the millennia since collecting pieces of shardic power. And crucially, this is deliberate. So we see him take on different magical abilities in all of these various books. Just briefly on that, in the Stormlight Archive, as I've already mentioned, he bonds a cryptic and becomes radiant. So he takes on a piece of Honor's power. In Elantris and in Tress of the Emerald Sea, we see him first try and then eventually succeed in becoming Elantrian. So we see him take on a piece of the Shard's devotion and dominion's power. In Mistborn, we see him gain Allomantic power, which means basically that he takes on a piece of the Shard Preservation's power. We learn that he has breath, which is a piece of endowment's power, and he has access to sand mastery, which is a piece of autonomy's power. In addition to all of this, he has access to Yolish light weaving, so like some form of power from his origins in Yolin, and then he also obviously carries a Dawn Shard. So that's a lot of different types of power or investiture that he is collecting deliberately across the 10,000 years that he's been wandering the Cosmere. And number 5 is that despite presenting as a loner, he actually has some pretty significant personal ties. We learn in the Isles of the Emberdark that he had a wife. We don't know a lot about her, except for the fact that she doesn't remember him anymore, so there's some sort of tragedy associated with his wife or his personal relationship out there. He also develops a relationship with Yasna, as I mentioned in the Stormlight Archive. Whether she's his wife in the future or whether the wife is somebody else is not clear to me. But again, he develops these kind of romantic entanglements, and he may have kids. Specifically, there's a reference to twins that he may have had, and again, that we know essentially nothing about. And these kind of personal relationships show, I think, that he isn't quite as like free-floating and untethered as he likes to present. There are familial obligations and responsibilities that are tethering him somewhere. We just don't know exactly where or how. And so these 5 points to me add up to a Hoid that is kind of made of contradictions. So somebody that destroyed a piece of God but then didn't take on that power, somebody that pretends to be like free-floating but is actually quite tethered, and somebody that pretends to reject power that actually ends up then deliberately acquiring a bunch of different power just in a very different way. And all of this leads to part 3, which is how do we make sense of all of this? And as I mentioned, I've broken it out into 3 major buckets of theory, which I think kind of help us think about all of these various facts together. The first theory is that he is the cosmic caretaker, that his aims are benevolent and that he's looking to like save the Cosmere in some sort of way. There are a few supporting clues that back up this theory. The first one is that if there's one consistency in Hoid, in the Stormlight Archive at least, is that we see him consistently oppose odium, which is the single most, I would argue, destructive shard of force in the Cosmere at this time. He also supports kind of like what we may perceive as like the good guys. He supports Dalinar, he supports Yasna, he supports Kaladin, people that are generally trying to do their best despite some pretty adverse circumstances. And then we also see him comfort characters and peoples across the Cosmere during their darkest moments. And he uses his storytelling and other abilities to bring this comfort, which seems to suggest that he has like some decency at least in him. If you take this kind of like framework that he is some sort of like a secret protector of the Cosmere, his role in the Shattering of Adonalsium you could read as a misguided, potentially, attempt to improve creation. And in this reading, you could assume that he didn't quite predict the impact of unleashing odium and is then trying to spend millennia atoning or fixing the results that he has created by the shattering. This also helps frame his emotional detachment, which you could read, I think, then as less actual detachment, but as a sign of self-preservation because he's trying to do something bigger than just something at the individual level. And at some level, then, that solitude becomes sacrifice. But there's kind of like a totally opposite reading of Hoid's motivations here that I'm terming as the selfish seeker, because I think you could argue that he is more selfish than that interpretation that I just talked through seems to suggest. In fact, rather than having these like underlying benevolent aims, it's possible that Hoid might be trying to collect all of this power in order to replace Adonalsium potentially with himself. So this becomes like this effort to install himself as one of the most powerful characters in the Cosmere. Alternatively, he could also have more selfish aims in that he could be trying to undo that personal tragedy, maybe with his wife or his kids that I mentioned, and so his goals across the Cosmere in collecting power and engaging is in order to fix something more personal to himself, And his own words support this. The quote that I mentioned is that if I have to watch this world crumble and burn to get what I want, I will do so, suggesting that he prioritizes something about himself or his goals above others. And Brandon himself has said that Hoid is more selfish than I think we realize. And so he could be seeking a kind of a really different type of a power, and he could be seeking to like something that is more personal to himself than something that is more cosmic in scale. The third theory, and potentially the most simple one here, is that he has no good plan. So he's kind of an aimless wanderer. As a reminder, what we learned in the Stormlight Archive is that Hoid is either founded, I think, or at least is part of a group known as the World Singers, whose mission is to tell stories and spread peace through understanding. And that kind of could be all that he's doing in the Cosmere. He could just be flitting around the Cosmere, telling stories, trying to create understanding among different civilizations and different planets, and that's the extent of his role. That also kind of then feeds into a little bit of what he tries to present about himself. That's somebody who values freedom rather than entanglements, and somebody that purposely rejects power because he rejected a shard. So under this view, his interventions are basically, when they exist, they're kind of ad hoc. They're not like premeditated in any form. And he's just like this kind of long-lived wanderer who occasionally steps in when it feels right. So this gets into like, okay, we have these three frameworks. What do we actually think? So my take is that Hoid's goals didn't stay constant. They evolved over the 10,000 years that he's been wandering the Cosmere. And even if originally his goals in shattering Ad Nauseam were for power or salvation or whatever it is, I think it's possible that that has changed and evolved over the course of his existence. And I think you need to go back to some of the things that are constant about Hoid. He opposes odium pretty consistently, and he feels some regret about his role in the shattering of Ad Nauseam. So I think it's possible that even if his goals in the shattering of Ad Nauseam were more selfish at the time, since then, he acknowledges that there has been instability or chaos that has been created by the shattering of Ad Nauseam, especially by the unleashing of odium, and he's spending his time trying to prevent or undo some of that damage that he had a role in creating. What that means is that while he may have once sought control or improvement in the past, what he's now seeking to do is something closer to prevention, to keep the universe from fracturing further and potentially to restore it to something that is more stable. So he's neither savior nor villain. He's essentially just a flawed being trying to correct a divine mistake without repeating it. So I think in total, there's a lot we still don't know. And I think there's a lot that I think might be unveiled as we get more and more books. And until we finally see what happened at Yolen, in Yolen 10,000 years ago, there'll still be a lot of uncertainty about Hoid's motivation. But at the end of it all, in my take, is that Hoid is a person or a man that has learned that even gods can make mistakes, and sometimes the only way to make amends for what you've done is to just keep going. And so I think what you can tell from this is that I really love Hoid. I think he's one of the most interesting and important characters in the Cosmere, and would love for you all to tell me in the comments below what your favorite Hoid story or quote is. And if you like this kind of content, please hit like and please subscribe to All Things Cosmere. Thanks everyone.